see here. Check, check, check. You guys hear me all right? Okay. Well, we got a few stragglers that we'll wait on here. So. There we go. That way you can see more of my beautiful, handsome face, you know. There we go. All right. How you doing? Slide on in. All right. Sorry if this gets in your way. Okay, we ready? Okay. Put hers over here. All right. All right. Hello. How's everybody doing? Good. My name is John Leyendecker. I'm the director for the Holy Family School of Faith here in the Archdiocese of Cincinnati. If you want to, sorry, I have a little bit of a cold, so it's hard to get it just right here. Maybe I'll hold it. How's that? A little better, you know? I'm the director for the Holy Family School of Faith here in the Archdiocese of Cincinnati. We are an international organization, actually. We have a daily rosary meditation. If you ever want to check it out, go to schooloffaith.com or wherever you get your podcasts at. But we have a daily rosary meditation that goes out. It gets over 85,000 downloads a day in over 144 countries across the world now. So if you're a person who loves the rosary, it's a great opportunity for meditation. If you are a person who isn't used to the rosary, it's a great way to get introduced because it's different in the meditation style, but still contains the 5 decades. So again, 85,000 people are listening to it every day and more on the weekends. So just to let you know. What we have here today is a copy of the Shroud of Turin. And this, depending on how familiar you are with the Shroud of Turin, is one of only about 101 copies in the world. So a very unique opportunity for you to come together today. And you might be asking what a slouch like me is doing with it, right? If there's only so few. It is a copy. Don't think it's, it's not the real one. It hasn't been touched to it. It's not a relic in that sense. But there is a Shroud of Turin research facility in Colorado Springs. And in order for you to obtain one of these copies, our organization had to send a person out there to study the Shroud for 7 full days in order to get it. And he came back and trained us over that entire week, right? So as we go through today, there's going to be, I always talk about the Shroud as an amazing experience between faith and science. It's where faith and science meet. And I'm going to talk to you today about the man of the Shroud of Turin. I'm not going to say that it is the burial cloth of Jesus. I'm going to leave that up to you and your decisions at the end. But the church does say that we may highly reverence the Shroud of Turin because it is, in fact, a crucified man, and it does imitate and tell us very much what our Lord would have went through in his crucifixion, death, and burial. The Shroud of Turin, if you're familiar or not, is a 13 foot by 3.5 foot, 14 foot by 3.5 foot triple woven linen garment. Linen, as you know, is made from flax, and that's going to be very important later on. But this is 100% linen. It's triple woven. It would have been a very, very expensive and upper class garment for Jesus' time or material, right? It's the most examined ancient artifact in history. There have been over 62 disciplines applied to the Shroud of Turin. And in fact, it's the only ancient artifact that you can get your own PhD in just this article alone. And that study of the Shroud is called Sidenology. You can get a PhD in Sidenology. It was first shown to the public and put on display by Geoffrey de Charny in the 14th century in France. Possibly, as I said, it's the burial cloth of Jesus. The church does not take a stance on it, but says we can reverence it. It's been highly preserved at the cathedral in Turin, where it's resided since 1578, and currently it's brought out for viewing only every few years. The last time it was brought out for viewing was during the pandemic, because the Archbishop of Turin wanted to have hope for the world, so he put the Shroud on display during a live stream. This is the 1978 photograph of the Shroud of Turin, so you're able to see much more detail than what you can actually see today. It's kind of a sad fact, but the shroud hasn't always been taken care of very well, so this is actually more detail than you would be able to see if you went and saw it in person today, because of how they've allowed light exposure to hit it and different things. In addition to that, the shroud as it is today, like I said, it's been exposed to much more light. And then there was also a fire in the Cathedral of Turin, which was affected by it. They finally learned their lesson, and now it's in an oxygen-free, like, glass case, all that stuff. And it wasn't, in the beginning, it was in that too during the fire. And part of the problem is that when the building caught on fire, they couldn't open it. They didn't have the key, and they had to break the glass, and it went through all kinds of tumultuous stuff. But the shroud, as we'll talk about in history, has been through a lot anyway, so it can kind of take it. This is from that original investigation, the STIRP project in 1978, and it's by a forensic photographer named Barry Schwartz. Barry Schwartz was a Jewish man, not a very believing Jewish man, but he thought when he was going on this STIRP investigation that he was going to go see it, study it for about 10 minutes, and that was it. He was going to see that it was dye or that it was paint or that it was one of these things, and it wasn't going to be a big deal. 15 minutes later, Barry Schwartz was wondering what the heck this thing is, right? Barry Schwartz, although at the time, like I said, an atheistic Jewish man, is now one of the biggest proponents of the shroud being a miraculous artifact from the 1st century. One thing to add, he's still not a Christian, but he still thinks this is a miraculous artifact. So that should tell you something, right? So I want to just kind of take us through a trip here as we've looked at this. I just want to ask you, what do you notice first as you look at the shroud? What do you notice? What stands out to you first? What's that? Yeah, there are some burn marks here. Oh, maybe I lost my guy. Oh, there's the battery. If you look, some burn marks here. Affectionately, when I gave this presentation to my kids, they call these owls. See how they kind of look like owls? They got the little eyes there. You see that? So these are, in fact, burn marks, and they're from a fire in Chambry, France in 1532. The shroud, as I said, was put on display in the 14th century, in the 1300s, but in 1532 there was a fire, and it was kept in a lead reliquary. And as you know, lead doesn't do too well during extremely hot temperatures. And as that lead began to melt, it started to pour through the shroud, so to speak. But that's also where we get some of these, see these watermarks here too around it? There's watermarks because a monk trying to save the shroud threw a jug of water on it and was able to still get it out of the cathedral as it burned, right? So that's good news for us today. These are really interesting, and they're going to play a huge role. We're going to talk about the shroud later. These are patches. Do you see these? These are patches that were put on by Poor Clare nuns in the 16th century after that fire. So these are the patches. You can see some of them. And what's unique about these patches, and this is going to be important later when we talk about carbon dating of the shroud, these patches are made from cotton. And what's also present in the cotton is a thing called gum dye. Gum dye is a medieval kind of glue that you would use to help patches adhere better as you were sewing them in. So these patches contain 100% cotton and gum dye. And again, that's going to be very important later on when we talk about. Now, one thing that's not from that fire in Chambray, France, that's very important to notice, are these, see this L here? Do you see that? These are not from that fire. These are from incense burns from ancient liturgies. And that's going to be very important when we talk about the history of the shroud and how it might have come down to us if it was, in fact, the burial cloth of Christ, okay? But keep that in mind. These little burn holes are not from the fire. Those are from incense. And maybe you've seen that before. Those of you who've been around the church long enough, when the guy with the incense is getting a little crazy, or when Father, kind of swings it a little jolted, like throws out and burns a couple things, right? But that's from that. So just so you know. Believe me, these notes are for you because I know so much random stuff about the shroud. This is just going to keep me on track so that we get out of here on time today. So, but if you start to look past these little burn holes and the things that we're talking about, these stains, you get to the image of the man. You have to understand that the shroud, the image, is on the top third of the fibrils of the linen garment, which shows you something big because the blood stains, see these markings here? And then this is the face. And this is, see this, the back of the head here where the blood is pooled? You see that a little bit? And I also gave it to you on your handout because I know this is hard to see. But if you look on the handout, you can see these. That's actual blood. I want you to know that. That is, in fact, actual blood. We were able to get a blood type from that. We weren't able to get a complete DNA sample because so many people have touched the shroud over time. We don't have a perfect DNA, but we do have the AB that you see in every Eucharistic miracle. I'll just put that out there. And you can see the blood on there, but the image itself, do you see the face? You have to understand, that is not blood. That's an image that rests on the top third of the fibrils. It's not miraculous in the same way that the tilma of Our Lady of Guadalupe, if you've studied anything of that, I do encourage you, if you don't know about Our Lady of Guadalupe and the tilma, please look into that. But that miraculously exists above the cactus fibers. That's a scientific anomaly. This, on the other hand, is also a scientific anomaly, but not in the same way because it's contained in the top third of the fibrils. And we'll talk about why that's even more important later, and how that could be possible. But this is actual. The Shroud of Turin is a photographic negative on a non-photographic substance. And I want to point out, I like that this is an older crowd. You guys remember cameras and film, right? I was talking to, 6th and 7th and 8th graders this morning, and they kind of knew about it, right? But you all know about film. How easy would it be for, you know how film works, right? So light transfers onto a photographic material and it leaves the image behind, right? That's what happens. This is a non-photographic material. So to put a photograph on a non-photographic material is, in a sense, impossible. The only place where we've seen anything like this, and again, we'll come back to this towards the end, is at the bomb site of Nagasaki in Hiroshima, the atomic bomb. There were light images put on things that are not photographic material from the incredible amount of light from that blast. So I just want to say, and we'll talk about this, how this could be possible that it's on here. This is a miraculous image because it's a photographic negative on a non-photographic material. I want to help you understand how the shroud exists too. If you understand here, this, and I'll get out of the way too, but this is his face, right? This is his face. This is the back of his head, his back going down to his legs here, right? And then you see his hands. And you can compare that on your sheet too. You can see that all the way down the legs. You have to understand, if this were the shroud, if we were to lay it flat on the ground, that he would be laying on his back here, right? Do you see that? He'd be laying on his back, and the shroud would be folded over. So the face is actually the inside touching the face. One thing that most people don't know about the shroud, after that fire in the cathedral in Turin in 2002, the Vatican paid for this to be refurbished. And it was partly a disaster because only the Vatican can do bad things to sacred art like this, right? But one bad thing they did, and we're going to talk about this, but they vacuumed it to restore it. Now, why it's bad that they vacuumed it is because a good amount of the proof for this being an older artifact actually comes from the pollen fossils and things that existed in it. But one thing they did discover was, in refurbishing it, they took the backing off of it, and they discovered a third image on the shroud. There's actually, on the face side, there's another image of the man on the other side. what's really neat about that, and most people don't know this, if you look on the face of the man, you can turn on to the face portion. You can see how his face is slightly distorted. One side is down a little bit, and we're going to talk about that. His right side of his face, if you look on the shroud, it's his right here is down, and we're going to talk about why that's important in the wounds and things. But on the other side of the shroud, where he would be, let's say, coming out of it, that's his face is fine. It's put back together, so to speak. So we'll talk about why that's important later, but I just wanted to point that out now as we're going through. Not only is this a photographic image on a non-photographic substance, it's actually an X-ray and 3D image. 3D in the sense that it contains all of the 3D things we need. Forensics can actually see inside of the wounds on this. That makes it a pretty incredible image. Like, we can see inside of the side wound and see exactly how big it is and tell that it would be the same exact side as a Roman pilon or a Roman spear. Now, it could be a wound from something else, but we do know it is the same size as a Roman pilon, right? Another thing, if you look at the image on your sheet, if you look at his hands on the back on the double images, if you look at his hands, see how elongated his fingers are? Do you see that? They're elongated because you're not just seeing an image, you're actually seeing an X-ray image, and you're seeing the bones in his fingertips, which is pretty incredible, right? Second, if you turn over to the front again, you see not only the beard and the lips, but you can faintly see the teeth of this man, showing that it's an X-ray image, not just a regular image as well. Now, if that isn't enough for you to be wowed, let's keep going, right? Because this all seems rather miraculous. Maybe it is. There are lots of boxes that need to be checked for a theory to explain all of this. There is one theory that does actually fit all of it so far and checks all the boxes, but we'll come back to this later, how this will all be. Now, I want you to notice the blood, right? We talked about some of the blood here in the scourging marks, right? The blood is real blood. It's red. The reason it's left to us today, that it's so red and so orange today, is because of the fact that it has a high amount of bilirubin in it. It's an enzymatic protein that shows when this man went before he died, he was in a tremendous amount of shock from being tortured. That protein is in there, and we can see that, and that's one of the reasons it's come down to us and lasted this long, right? During the 1978 investigation, I want you to know something about this. This is pretty cool. They prepared for this investigation for 17 months before they flew to Turin. 17 months. They had a myriad of scientists on this. They flew to Turin a week early to get prepared. And when they studied the shroud for 1 week, they studied it 24 hours a day. Teams of scientists broke up into 8-hour units, and they studied it continuously for 7 days. And so the number of things they determined, which we'll get into, but maybe two of most significance. This was a man buried in this cloth who was tortured and crucified with real wounds and blood, no hoax or artistic depiction. One non-Christian scientist speculated that it might be a Christian from the Middle Ages, tortured and crucified like his Lord. They set aside the protocol for carbon dating at that time in 1978. And we're going to talk about carbon dating here in a little bit because it's pretty important, because I don't know if you remember this, in 1988 they did carbon dating sampling, and it came back that the shroud was in fact from the Middle Ages, not from the 1st century. I can explain that, and we'll talk about that in a minute, because the shroud has now been proved inconclusively that it is from the 1st century. Inconclusively, right? Conclusively, sorry, not inconclusive, conclusively. 1st century, no question about it. We'll talk about that in a minute. But this blood is hemoglobin. It's an AB blood type. I talked about the partial DNA, the enzyme, the protein in there. But I think what we'll do now, let's look at the wounds for a little bit. Does that sound good? And again, you want to reference the back of your sheet to kind of see a little better as we're going through. We can tell from this, if you look at the head, we can tell that this crown was a full crown not just a crown around. Crowns in the ancient period around Second Temple Judaism weren't just little crowns, they covered the whole head, right? And so when they made this crown, it wasn't any different. We can tell that from forensics that this man has over 62 wounds on his head. Over 62. Some people ask me sometimes too, I just want to bring this up, that when, Notre Dame Cathedral burned down in France a little while ago, if you remember that, right? And they were able to rescue the crown of thorns. But if you look at that crown, it's just a circular crown. And they say, well, how could that be if the shroud says this and that's that? And I say, well, actually, it makes perfect sense, because those branches are pretty thick if you look at them. The other branches around the top would have had to be very new branches, very thin, because they would have to, arch over and things like that. And that would be very easy to decay over time. Whereas those other branches would be able to be preserved better, right? So that's a possibility. I'm not saying one is what and one is the other, but, you can take it with a grain of salt. So, but the crown was a dome. It was not a wreath, and over 62 marks on his head. You can see here how the blood pooled in the back. Do you see that? So, pretty incredible. One of the saddest things to talk about, really, for me, this is the thing that gets me every time, is the nails through his wrists. And you can see that on your handout really well. But if you see here, see the nail mark there? And then, down in there, you can't see it quite as well. But so that nail mark, that's really, remember how I said it has a 3D element to it? We can see into it. We can see, because of this, the shroud, that he wasn't nailed once, but twice. He was nailed twice through the wrists. And why this is important is that in ancient Roman crucifixion, they would pre-drill the nail holes, right? Or pre-nail the holes, so that when you put the person's hand there, it was easier to go in. We know that the man of the shroud is 5'10". 5 feet 10 inches tall is very tall by either Middle Ages or first century standards, right? No question. Romans were perfecters of Greek torture. That's what you have to remember. Anything the Greeks did that were torturous, Rome wanted to do it worse. The Greeks came up with crucifixion. The Romans figured out how to do it better. So what happens is they would nail through where your two bones meet in your wrist, where there's a huge conglomeration of nerves. So every time you would move your hand, it would feel like fire shooting through your body. Anybody you know who's had carpal tunnel, it's an extremely painful thing because it affects these nerve endings in their wrist, right? In fact, you could say that it's excruciating. And many of you, I don't know if you know or not, but excruciating comes from the Latin from the cross, from the crucifixion, right? So literally excruciating. And the thing about this is important, is because he had to be nailed twice, because they wanted his arms at a perfect 15-degree angle. Right? They wanted it just right, because they wanted ultimately people on the cross to die of asphyxiation. You didn't die because of blood loss. You didn't die because of shock. You didn't die because of anything. You died because you couldn't breathe anymore, because you couldn't raise yourself up, and your lungs would fill with fluid so badly because of not being able to do this that you would ultimately suffocate to death. Right? This is important. You can tell that they had to move his arms because they didn't have the angle right and had to nail him again. So not only was he pierced once through the wrist, but twice in that huge conglomeration of nails to get the angle just right. And I don't know if you realize or not, with crucifixion, people didn't usually carry their whole cross. They carried their crossbar, which was about 100 pounds or more. Because what you would do, I wish I had both hands, what you would do in crucifixion is you wouldn't just, whole cross, nail somebody to it. It would be the crossbar. You would nail their hands, their wrists to it in that extremely painful spot. And then people would pick that up and set it on the stylus, right? The straight up and down piece for the cross. And there would be a hole in there that would go on it. And then we know of Jesus, of course, above it on that little piece of wood sticking out, had the sign that he was the King of the Jews in all three languages, Greek, Hebrew, and Aramaic, right? Was put up there, Greek, Hebrew, and Latin, put above his cross that, Jesus Christ, King of the Jews. But he would have been lifted up and then set on there. So incredible torture. Every time you pick yourself up, excruciating pain. Lightning through your whole body would be what it would feel like. So very timely to be meditating on this during Holy Week. The same with his feet. His feet would have been nailed in such a way that it would go back through the heel bone, where there was a huge conglomeration of nerves in the same way. So notice which finger is missing. Can you tell which finger is missing if you look at it? Yeah, his thumb's missing. And do this with me. Hold out your hand. See how your thumb kind of sits out if you just let it hang? That second nailing is the reason why his thumb is behind his hand. Because your ligaments and muscles hold your thumb up like this, right? When you just try to let your thumb drop, it won't. If you pierce through that ligament, your thumb will fold under because it has nothing to hold out anymore. And so his ligament was pierced, his thumb folds under, and rigor mortis sets in after he dies, and the thumb stays that way. Do you see that? So just a little note there. So you can kind of see on your back side of the sheet here, if you look on the right side bottom, it's harder to see on the shroud, but you see all that blood that's pooled there? That goes back to what I'm talking about. He would have been nailed through his heel bone, so blood is pouring out of that, and you can actually see it on there, right? They nailed through the heel for the same reasons. They wanted it to be extremely painful, right? Now I want to talk about the wounds in the back, which is always tough to talk about. On the front of this man, there's over 100 scourgings, right? Over 100 individual wounds. On the back, there's over 200. Now, if you go to Rome today, you can actually see there are actually flagrums, Roman flagrums on display there. And these flagrums range from pieces of bone or ceramic or rocks tied on the end. But we know from the forensic evidence here that these are actually the flagrum with the pieces of balls of metal tied on the end. Little balls of metal like this. And so every time, again, Romans were perfecters of Greek torture. The Greeks thought if you made it long, you would get more oomph when you hit. And the Romans knew that that wasn't true. If you shortened it, you could cause much more damage. And so when they did it, imagine these little balls coming at incredible speed and being whipped back. They would plunge into the flesh, right? Tearing it and then ripping away and then hitting again. And he struck over 200 times on the back, 100 on the front. Pretty devastating, In addition to that, we can tell from forensic science now. This is amazing. What we're going to know even more about the shroud in 10 years is going to be incredible. But we can tell now that he was scourged by two men, and one of the men was slightly taller than the other man. Right? I mean, that's just incredible. CSI is real. That kind of thing. So, but just incredible. Yeah, what this man had to suffer was crazy. So that's the wounds. Let me get a sip of water here real quick. I want to talk about the carbon dating now. The carbon dating was done 10 years after the Stirp investigation. The Stirp investigation was in 1978. The carbon dating was actually done 10 years later. And the carbon dating was supposed to be 7 samples from 7 random areas all over the shroud, right? Like, so one there, one here, 7 random samples. And then those 7 samples would be cut into 7 and then sent to 7 labs throughout the world. That's not what happened. They took one sample, They cut it into 3, and they sent it to one lab to get the carbon dating done. Some people speculate that this was malicious because they wanted the shroud to come back, not what it was purported to be. I don't know anything about that. All I know is that from 1988 on, people basically stopped looking at the shroud because they said, oh, the carbon dating proves it. But a man who was on this investigation kept looking at it. He said, I don't think this is right. And he looked at, and I'll tell you about this. You know the company 3M, the chemical company? They actually made a special tape just for the STRP investigation. They made these little squares of tape so that the shroud could be preserved in whatever pollen and whatever it had on it in every inch of the shroud. So they have all of those samples to this day. They took this 3M tape, they put it on it, and then they took it off and sealed it, right? They looked at the exact same tape where they took the sample of the carbon dating from, and they found out that it came from one of the patches. And how did they know that? Because the sample they took, if they matched it up with the actual 3M tape, and guess what was on there? Cotton and gum dye. I told you about that earlier. This garment, this linen shroud, does not have any cotton on it except for the Middle Ages cotton, the patches. So that makes sense that it would come back from the Middle Ages, doesn't it? Of course, because it's from a time when they did that. And the fact that there's gum dye on it is also a total giveaway, because gum dye is like a glue, and there's no need for any glue on this shroud, right? Fast forward to just last year, a guy by the name of Liberto De Caro, he's a scientist in Italy. He actually did this gets into a little nerd weeds here, but carbon dating isn't the best way to tell how old a garment is necessarily. He did what was called wide X-ray spectrum scattering. And that is a different approach, and it measures the cellulose in the fibers to tell how old it is, which is much more appropriate to a garment, to a thing like this, than you would dating anything else, right? And so in this shroud, when he did that, it came back to the 1st century, give or take 50 years. So this was the conclusive proof, and this came through just in the last year. So it's unfortunate that we don't have more time to actually spend with the shroud and studying it in person, but they've been able to do so much just from the original STRP investigation, from what they've done. So I will tell you that it does actually point to the fact that it is 1st century, and it is a real man that was crucified, and it's possibly him, maybe, right? But now, I want to talk to you about 2 things, right? I want to talk to you about pollen fossils, right? Let's see the time on here. Pollen fossils. Have you ever heard of this? Pollen fossils. So whether you and I realize it or not, just like if you go down to a creek bed and there's fossils and all the rocks and stuff like that, there are actually pollen fossils left on your clothes from 100 years ago or 1,000 years ago or 2,000 years ago. And you can actually study those fossils to tell where a garment has been, or a shroud in this case. They studied the pollen fossils that existed on the Shroud of Turin from those 3M sticky tape, right? Because remember what I say, what did the Vatican do in 2002? Vacuumed it, which was the worst thing we could have done. But we have the 3M sticky tape. And guess where the largest conglomeration of pollen fossils comes from? Jerusalem and northern Judea, with actually 5 species of plants indigenous to that area alone on the shroud. Second is from a place called Edessa, Turkey. And I don't know if you know this or not, but when Christians began to be persecuted and the temple fell, a good amount of Christians went to Edessa, Turkey. And actually, Saint Athanasius actually has a sermon where he talks about the shroud at full length was taken to Edessa. Isn't that cool? We see that back then, that a shroud of the burial of Jesus at full length was taken to Edessa. Now in Edessa, it was recorded all over and over again that there was a thing called the Mandylion, and it was the face of Christ. A lot of people didn't realize that it was the whole burial cloth of Christ because they had it folded. See how you see these ancient folding lines? Man, my little clicker is messing up on me. There we go. There we go. you can see where it's been creased over the years, right? You see that? And so what's important about that is it was folded to show only the face. And what's interesting is that from the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd century, images of Jesus started to drastically change. If you remember, he was portrayed as a Roman in the catacombs, but then as art grew, he was portrayed very much as a Semitic man. And we think that's in part because why? There was an image that was on display in Edessa, Turkey, that showed what he looked like, just like the image on the front of your paper, right? Something also very neat about this have you heard of the icon, the Pantocrator? It's a very famous icon that's in St. Catherine's Monastery. It's painted sometimes between the 5th and 6th century. In FBI facial recognition, you need 51 or a couple more points of congruence for something to be an exact match. Like if I had a picture of you and another picture of you, you need 51 points of congruence to have a match. The Shroud of Turin and the Pantocrator, that icon, and you can look it up when you go home, actually has over 100 points of congruence. So we think that the Pantocrator was made from that exact image that they saw, right? What's that? 5th, 6th century. And it's in 5th, 6th century, and it's in St. Catherine's Monastery in Egypt. Very famous. And what's amazing about this, and I didn't talk to you guys about this, I wanted to save it for this, for the wound part. In the Pantocrator, it's talked about as a meditation. One side of the face of Jesus is judgment, and one is mercy, because one of his face seems longer. His right side on your sheet, right? On this negative, actually, I think it's his left side, but it's his right side on the actual shroud, the right side of his face. And you see the hand that's longer? That side, they can tell that this is from a partial paralysis that probably would have come from the fact that a large beam fell on the side of his neck. You ever seen a kung fu movie where they're like, hi-ya, and the person goes limp? That's actually true. If you suffer enough trauma on your neck right there, the right side of your body will experience paralysis. And so how do we know this also? Well, because they found dirt on his knee, on his feet, and on his face, right? Where he would have fallen, right? It's on his right side to his left knee, right? Would have gone down. One interesting thing about that dirt that they discovered, it was a travertine aragonite. And that travertine aragonite soil, it could be found anywhere in the world, possibly, but the only place we've found it so far is on the steps of the temple in Jerusalem in archaeological excavations. The only place we've found that soil that they found in the shroud is on the steps of the temple in archaeological digs in Jerusalem. So, huge important point, right? So they would have carried the shroud up north to the persecution. We have St. Athanasius talking about that. And then the image of Edessa, or the Mandylion is what it was called. And then Edessa is captured by the Muslims in 943. And Muslims began to rule Edessa. And what happens is in 943, the Byzantine emperor at the time, I can give you his name, I have it in the notes. The Byzantine emperor, Byzantine Emperor Romanus I actually sent 80,000 troops, this is documented, 80,000 troops to go get that cloth. And they were successful, and they brought it to Constantinople. And remember I told you about pollen fossils, right? The first and largest conglomeration was Jerusalem. Second was Edessa, Turkey. Third was Constantinople. And one very interesting thing I want to tell you about Constantinople is that, do you guys know much about the Byzantine Church, Byzantine Catholic Church, or Orthodox, Eastern Orthodox churches? So Orthodox churches and Byzantine Catholic churches model their worship on the liturgy that took place in the Hagia Sophia in Constantinople, okay? Very beautiful liturgy. I'm actually a Byzantine Catholic. And we do one really crazy thing. Every Good Friday, we have a thing called Burial Vespers. And remember, we imitate what happened then in that cathedral. And do you know what my priest does every Good Friday? He takes a cloth that has an icon that looks suspiciously like this, Christ crucified, laying out like this, hands the same way, everything, him lying there, he puts it on his back and he processes around the church. And this is how we got those ancient incense marks, because that's what happened. They would parade the shroud around the cathedral. Most people think they would fold it in such a way that, the face would be pointing out, right? And they would, he would have it over his back like this. And if you come to my church on Friday night, you could see him walk with this little shroud around. Isn't that crazy? So it's even the liturgy bearing witness to this truth a millennia later, right? Which is very important. So, just another thing too, the most ancient book is called the Prayer Codex. It's the most ancient prayer manuscript in Hungarian. It's also the earliest witness to the Hungarian language. It has this picture in the book. And what's suspect about it, people try to say it isn't, but what it is, the arms are crossed at the wrists the same way here, right? Missing the thumbs. And here's the real giveaway. These L-shaped poker holes, they're on the Hungarian Prayer Codex in 1192. If you were going to, think about it, if you were going to paint an image, right, and it even shows the mistakes of the image, that's a pretty good witness, don't you think? That's better than 1532 at least. So we're tracing the shroud back, right? We're tracing it all the way back. But they bring it to Constantinople, and an unfortunate thing happens in the Fourth Crusade, right? Do you guys know much about the Crusades? The first three were pretty good. The fourth one goes a little south, okay? No matter what anybody else tells you about the first three. The first three were pretty good. The fourth one, though, goes a little south. What happens is the Crusaders load up, they're on their way to the Holy Land, and instead of getting to the Holy Land and liberating the Holy Land, they actually stop in Constantinople and they murder and pillage and steal all kinds of relics and artifacts, right? And so it seems at that point the shroud was probably taken to Athens, because the fourth largest signature of pollen fossils on the shroud is in Athens. And so Theodore Angelos, the nephew of the Byzantine emperor, was angered and sent a letter to Pope Pius III. He said, "A crusading army falsely set out to liberate the Holy Land and instead laid waste to the city of Constantine. During the sack, troops of Venice and France looted even the holy sanctuaries. The Venetians partitioned the treasures of gold, silver, and ivory, while the French did the same with the relics of the saints. And most sacred of all, the linen in which our Lord Jesus Christ was wrapped after his death and before his resurrection." Now, that is a witness. That's a letter written in 1203. We know that the sacred objects are preserved by their predators in Venice, in France, and in other places. The sacred linen in Athens. This is a letter, 1203. You can't forge this. This is real. The sacred linen is preserved in Athens. There was a guy named Othon de la Roche. Othon de la Roche was a crusader. He was actually investigated by Pius III because of several of these claims that he had stolen and pillaged and done all these things. The shroud goes underground completely until, guess what? It gets put on display in 1355 in Liry, France. And it's put on display by Geoffrey de Charny. But what's suspect is that Geoffrey de Charny's wife, Jeanne de Vergy, was the great-great-great-granddaughter of Othon de la Roche. And when Geoffrey de Charny was asked, "How did you come across this artifact?" all he would say was, "It was given to us freely." Do, right? So, pretty cool. I just want to finish up too with how could this, I said before we would talk about and end with, how could a non-photographic substance get a photographic negative on it, right? How does that even work? And so the first theory is this understanding of a corona discharge, okay? In order for this to happen, you would need the equivalent light power of being 10,000 miles from the sun. Imagine that, 10,000 miles from the sun. And it would leave this mark, that kind of nuclear reaction. But it would have to be so brief and just a moment that it wouldn't destroy the actual linen. It couldn't have any of the heat. It couldn't have any of that, right? It would have to be just so momentaneous. So it's as if this man in this shroud became light for a moment, right? Became light for a moment. Second, there's a theory that's now being thrown around. We need much more. I'm not going to go into it because it's so new and it's so whatever. But there's a thing called slow nuclear fusion. And there's some things about the shroud that because it rests on the top third fibrils, it would actually fit. It would actually fit because several of the particles would go out and leave this image. And let's leave it at that. It does kind of fit. There needs to be more research done on it, but it's profound, and it offers a lot. The thing I want to end with, though, that I think is really neat about the shroud at the end here, if you look at the end of the Gospel of John, remember when Peter and John run to the tomb? You remember that, right? Peter and John run to the tomb. Of course, John allows Peter to go in first, right? Which I always love that. He's letting the prince of the apostles in first, but he made sure to write in his gospel that he was faster than Peter, right? Isn't that awesome? Even the apostles can have a little fun, right? So, but when they go in, they see something and they believe in the resurrection, not just because that he isn't there, but if you look closely, they believe because of the way the garments were there. And here's what's funny about it. It's not translated very well in any Bible, to be honest, because there's arguments among scholars and all that stuff. But it talks about the garment being tied up and being in place. But the way most people translate it, it says, and tied up by itself, meaning like Jesus made his bed after he rose from the dead, right? No. It means tied up in place, meaning it's standing the way they left it. And the head and stuff is standing up because of all the blood and sweat. And what they would do is they would have a shroud, right? And they would take a cloth and tie the mouth closed so that no stuff came out, right? And so actually in John's gospel, it's more likely that the Greek there, it's the same word for tying the burial, jaw cloth. It's that word. It isn't tied up by itself. It's tied up standing by itself. Meaning the jaw is still tied around, and it's as if his head is still there, and the cloth is just laying flat. And this is giving them reason to believe in the resurrection, because the cloth is just as it was, but his body is not there. So that's really good. You can actually do some research on the internet on that. Most people believe that's the better translation. So at this point, I'm going to end, but I always try to leave some time for questions and stuff like that. So, yes.
I saw something about this on Science, I think it was, and they said that broke it so that he couldn't push up.
No, so when Jesus, to prove that he is dead, they would break people's legs to make sure they were. That way you couldn't pull up anymore. You couldn't push or pull to get up to get a breath. If you remember, Jesus' legs were not broken because they didn't break the bones of the Passover lamb. And Jesus is the new Passover lamb. So they put the pilon through his right side into his heart, and blood and water poured out, which we know are the sacraments, the church. That's why we say most appropriately, the fathers always said, some people you'll hear say the church is born on Pentecost, and it's like, no, the church is put out on mission in Pentecost. The church is born at that, when the blood and water pour out. So the legs of the man of the shroud are not broken. So, but most people in crucifixion would have been.
Science Channel.
Yeah.
This whole thing.
Yeah.
And said that the broken couldn't
Right.
push himself up to try to.
I think what they're saying is that's how they would normally do it, but the man of the shroud does not have broken legs. But you can go back and look at it. And I mean, you got to understand, they don't, Science Channel, History Channel this week is going to have a big thing about how Jesus probably didn't rise from the dead. You know what I mean? Like, that's what they do. They make their money on that, right? It's like, And this is for me, like I went to a Catholic college, and it seemed like every theologian there didn't believe that Jesus actually was who he said he was. And I'm like, we're the only ones that can give you a job because we believe it. Do you know what I'm saying? But you don't believe it, so that's my whole point. So maybe heard it wrong, or maybe they were just trying to disprove it. And there's all kinds of nonsense people will say, good or bad, about the shroud. People try to prove the shroud. This is one thing that you'll hear. People try to prove the shroud is definitely from the time of Jesus. They say you can make out a coin from the time of Pontius Pilate that's laid on his eyes. That's never been conclusively proven. That's why I don't put it in my presentation, right? But some people say that. But that comes from a guy, a priest actually, who is in the late 1800s said that he found that. We can't verify that, so I don't talk about it, right? So, yeah, good question. Yeah. In Turin right now, in the Cathedral of Turin.
Does it just always stay put?
No, it never travels. It's actually in this huge, thick glass case that's actually bulletproof, fireproof, waterproof, everything. And they only bring that case out once every few years. And like I said, the last time they brought it out was during the pandemic, and they live streamed it. So, and before that, I think it was like the Jubilee year or something like that. There's talk of it maybe being brought out this year. I know some people that are thinking about going to Turin, but they can't confirm yet if that's going to happen or not. Right, correct.
Is there any investigation going on now that's looking at trying to prove that?
Yep. So there's a ton of investigations. Like I said, you can get a PhD in this right now. There's a ton of investigations that are happening around the shroud, but not with the physical shroud right now. And scientists are always in negotiation with the Vatican to let them study it. Do you know what I mean? So, but it's hard too because the Vatican doesn't own it. Technically, the Archbishop of Turin owns it, and it's all this stuff. So, yeah. Well, I mean, like I said, the wide scattering X-ray, what they did to demonstrate the time of Jesus is big, right? It is. We know now it is a first century, linen shroud. We know that it's first century. I don't know if we ever could prove it's Jesus, except by taking away things, right? Like by default, because where else would you get that much energy? Actually, the energy, here's another thing. Here's a great scientific fact. The energy and light it would take to put that image on a non-photographic thing doesn't currently exist on Earth. Doesn't exist. We don't have that much here now. We might later, but right now we don't. So, yeah. Hold on.
Something happens to the body after you die, and the blood it separates, and it looked like water, but it included part of the blood.
Oh, like what would have come out from his side?
Yes, and that it was all done at the same time.
Yeah. Yeah. So here's what's really neat. Actually, so what we know is that he was pierced on his right side between his fifth and sixth rib, which we know from that angle. I mean, this is a great thing about forensics. We know it would have pierced the pericardial sac. And the pericardial sac actually, so it's not technically water, it's a watery substance that guards your heart. So blood and water poured out, right? And that was the fluid from the pericardial sac and the blood from his body, right? So that's what it was. What's that? Well, the blood is certainly there, and the fact that we know because of the shroud, we know where it pierced his rib, the man of the shroud at least, and that pilon would have hit the pericardial sac. We can tell that, so from the angle and all that stuff. So there is we have an AB blood type, which is the same blood type as every Eucharistic miracle. You know, that's a big deal, right? It's not a coincidence. Second, we have a partial DNA because it's been touched too many times, right? A thing I want to mention too about painting, because people talk about, oh, is the shroud painted, right? The shroud is not painted. Actually, the flecks of paint on the shroud, if you put them all together, you would still need a microscope to see the pile of flecks. And the reason for that is there's been over 50 documented things throughout history where people painted the shroud and then touched it to the shroud. Does that make sense? So that explains microscopic bits of paint. So, do you have a question?
You said it had a mechanism? That was
No, it's a metal ball. For the man of the shroud, at least, we know he was scourged by the flagrum that has metal balls at the end. We can tell by the way it makes the deep intrusion into the skin. But those metal balls would act like a hook, believe me. When you come down, like we said, come down, they would grab into the flesh and tear. It wouldn't just, it would rip open. So, again, yeah. Yeah, there's 101, I think, and this is one of them. Yeah, so this is basically a photograph of the photographic negative, which gives us a picture, right?
it's just been it's just kind of like an actual picture meaning
Yeah,
from
yeah. This is, but the difference is this is made from the actual 1978 Stirp photographic negative. Do you know what I'm saying?
it's not actually burned on parchment or something.
No, it's printed, 3D printed. So, but yeah. So it's just a copy. We didn't touch it to the shroud. It's not a relic. Like, it's just but it's an exact representation of what you would see if you looked at the shroud in 1978. So, yeah. Yeah. So there is the face cloth of Jesus, which is what you're probably making reference to, right? There's a face cloth, which again, there needs to be more studies done, but from the face cloth, right? It's an exact match to the shroud. So, but people haven't been able to do that with the actual shroud and with that. It's just, the images of both, and they've done some pretty intense work. And I'll say that with the pollen fossils too. The pollen fossils were done from that, it wasn't a shoddy investigation. It was actually the guy who's the foremost authority at the time on pollen fossils. He's passed away now, but it wasn't done with the shroud at the time. You know what I mean? So, but it's real research. So, but yeah.
So when the blood and water came out, that's actually cardiac fluid.
Yeah, pericardiac fluid, yeah.
The church designates the wine and putting blood into the chalice, putting water into the chalice.
Yes.
That's what it designates the blood and water.
Yes.
It's
And
not actually water, but it's a symbol.
Yeah.
It's actually, then it turns into the body, the blood.
right. Yeah, you have to understand the pericardial sac, it is water. It's predominantly water. It's just not, you wouldn't drink it, and you have to understand too, the very beautiful thing, the actual symbology of what the church does when Father puts that drop of water into the wine is all about our deification or our theosis, right? Catechism paragraph 460, St. Thomas or St. Athanasius said, God became man so that man might become God. You and I are going to become gods by grace. Just as those third of the angels fell out of the sky, we're going to replace that heavenly council. And we're going to be brought into the heavenly, right? We're going to take on the divine nature. That's what 1 Peter says. It says in the New Testament, you see dimly now as in a mirror, but you will see clearly then, for you shall be like him. So imagine a piece of iron being plunged into a fire. What happens to that piece of iron? All the impurities leave, and it takes on all the qualities of fire, and it still remains iron. That's your and my life in Christ forever in heaven. we're going to glow like him, right? That's theosis. That's deification. And quite frankly, that's the best kept secret about Christianity. That the whole point of Christianity is that you and I are going to be gods by grace. Now, Mormons abuse this. Mormons say you're going to be a god, get your own planet, and do all this weird stuff, right? That's not true. But that's how heresies work. They take a truth and they bend them, they twist them. But look at Catechism paragraph 460 when you get home. It's the most beautiful paragraph for what our destiny is about and what we will be as Christians, right? We will be like him forever. So that's a whole other talk. So
I watched the Pints with the Aquinas, Dr. Andrew, and you covered more stuff than on there. So thank
Oh,
you
wow.
so much.
Yeah.
There's a lot of fake stuff on the internet.
Yeah.
Can you direct us to some places where you think are
Yeah.
links?
Let me double check. It's actually one of the oldest websites on the internet. It was on the internet before Google. If you believe me or not. Let me go. The Shroud. I just want to get it right because some of them aren't right. Let me make sure this is it. No. Shroud. I can't find it right now. I'm sorry. But you're right to ask that because there is a... Maybe this is it. Yeah, this is it. Hold on. www.shroud.com. www.shroud.com. That website was actually on the internet, like I said, before Google. Let me just double check that Shroud. Yeah, no, it does. It looks like it, right? That's what it, yeah, that's how you know it's okay. This is an inexhaustible resource for the Shroud of Turin. This has all of the things that I talked about, but in academic research form, everything. You can go here and go down a rabbit hole for weeks, right? I have to actually keep myself off this sometimes. So, yeah, for real, seriously. But there's so much on there you can check out, so many things. Yeah. And there's been it's like 15 million visitors to that page or something, more than that. So pretty cool. Yeah.
There's also lectures by Father Robert Spitzer.
Oh, Father, yeah. So, yeah.
Watched one of them. There's several. I can't remember by the titles, but I've watched several of them, and one of them includes in-depth
Right.
facts.
Right. Yeah.
A lot of in-depth facts.
Yeah. So, yeah. 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 So Father Robert Spitzer, or you can go to his website, the Magis Center, MAGIS Center, Magis Center. Father Robert Spitzer is actually a trained physicist, and he's the one I talked about, that nuclear slow fusion. He's the one that actually explains that really well. I've spent time with Father Spitzer. He's an incredible man, faithful priest. He was the president of Gonzaga University for a long time. So, good man. So, he didn't play basketball, but yeah, hold on. Yes.
One of the first things you said is the cloth is
Yeah. Triple woven. I mean, it's not a single weave, it's a triple weave. Find somebody here who crochets, they'll tell you about it. Do you know what I mean? So it's just it's a better woven garment. It's thicker, it's more expensive. So instead of one stitch, you go 3 stitches, right? For every one, there's 3. Does that make sense? I mean, you'd have to...
like Egyptian cotton sheets where there's birds.
Yes, like exactly like that. If Egyptian sheets were hand woven, yes, exactly like that. More threads, put it that way. Yes, yes. These are very nice linen sheets. So, but yeah. it would have went through his heel bone. I mean, we don't know because we don't have his heel bone, right? But we have heel bones. We can turn that off if we want. We have Roman crucified heel bones where it doesn't break the heel bone; it just goes through, right? So, we have those we found them in archaeological digs. So, but yeah, about breaking the bones. Yeah, no, it can go through without breaking it. I mean, it pierces through. It's a little different bone area there. So, but yeah, so yeah, yeah. So we meet at Wright States Chapel, which is called St. John Bosco Chapel. It's St. John Bosco Chapel. It's on the campus of Wright State University. Yes, in Dayton. There's a Byzantine community there. Actually, there will be a Byzantine Divine Liturgy in Cincinnati on Easter at 1:30 p.m. at St. Anthony of Padua, because we're now having Byzantine Divine Liturgy here in Cincinnati every other week. But if you want to see the burial shroud, what we do, burial vespers, Friday, it's either at 6 or 7. You can check. It's called St. Barbara's Byzantine. You can Google it. You'll find it on the interwebs. St. Barbara's Byzantine Catholic Church. We meet at St. John Bosco, Wright State, and it's like 6 or 7 o'clock. We're doing burial vespers. So, what's that? PM. Yeah. Yes.
How much credence, if any, does the crown of thorns add to authenticity?
Like the actual one at Notre Dame?
No.
What do you mean?
The fact that he was
I had a crown of thorns? Yeah. It would make more sense because, like I said, ancient crowns weren't normally in a wreath pattern. They were more in a dome pattern, right? Oh, yeah. So the fact almost no one in the first century would have been crucified with a crown of thorns. Yeah. So, yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I was trying to see what, yeah, exactly.
I couldn't hear you before, but
Yeah.
we were talking about he was nailed twice.
Yes. Yeah.
Here?
From the shroud here. Would have been here. Yeah. Yes. There's 2 holes in the shroud. I'm not saying Jesus was nailed twice because I don't know if this is Jesus. You can make that assumption. But there's 2 nail holes for this man. And we can see those very clearly under forensic, study. So, but yeah. Yeah. We don't know of any. There's no other historical source of anybody being crucified with a crown of thorns. They wouldn't have needed to, No. And none that we have recorded. You know what I mean?
Then does that make it even more?
I would think so, right? But like I said, it's hard to say it is, right? You can't say it is when you don't know if it is, right? But it's like, well, if it walks like a duck, it talks like a duck, might be a duck, right? And if it was crucified like Jesus and it has all the gospel remnants of what Jesus is, might be, right? So, Kay, are you liberating me here? Because we could.
I know, we'll be here all day.
Yeah. Okay.
He's got to rest up for 6th, 7th, and 8th grade.
That's right. Thank you. Yes.
Thank you so much to John for all of that information. Thank you to all of you.